First off, good afternoon. I think, it's afternoon now. Welcome, congratulations. It is almost the end of 7th week. You're still surviving as far as I can tell. The days are getting shorter, the nights are getting longer. It can be a generally sad time, so keep going. You're almost there. The end is near. Anyways, secondly, I want to personally thank you for coming today. I know you guys have busy schedules. Thanks for taking the time to hear a very important question. See, I think this question is important because if Jesus existed and he was God, then his claims cannot simply be dismissed as fable or hoax. However, if Jesus didn't actually exist, then approximately 2 billion people around the globe are straight up wasting their time believing that he was God. So, at this point, just want to address the elephant in the room. Spoiler alert, the Oxford Christian Union brought in someone who's going to defend the historicity of Jesus. That might be shocking to you. However, I'm going to make the case that the claim that Jesus was historical and the story of Jesus is history is not just a Christian claim, it's a historical claim. So this phenomenon of questioning the existence of Jesus has become quite vogue in the past 2 decades, doubtless thanks to the work done by several of the new atheists. First up being the late Christopher Hitchens, who talked about the highly questionable existence of Jesus. Or take philosopher Michael Onfray, who said Jesus' existence has not been historically established. Or we can even talk about Oxford's own Richard Dawkins, who, citing the work of G.E. Wells, who's a professor of German at Birkbeck College of London, he argued that there's a serious historical case to be made that Jesus never existed. However, a short bit of academic research seems to refute quite strongly any of the various claims about Jesus' non-existence. And you're welcome to check all of these sources for yourself. Since it's Oxford, I'll first highlight the Oxford Classical Dictionary, 4th edition, 2012. In there is an assessment about the historical person of Jesus, and from that you'll find that not only did Jesus exist, he is historically regarded as a teacher-healer who died by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. Next, I would commend to you, with a grain of salt, obviously, because it's Cambridge. Cambridge Ancient History in 14 volumes, specifically volume 10. That's where you'll find Jesus. Within there, you'll find the scholars think it unquestionable that Jesus existed and he was killed by crucifixion. Finally, for my German speakers in here, I'll commend Grill's New Poly Encyclopedia of the Ancient World. It's massive, there's 20 volumes. Volume 8 is the one you're looking for. In there you'll also find not the slightest doubt of Jesus' existence, his reputation as a teacher-healer, and his crucifixion. Now, to be explicit, none of these sources up here have the slightest interest in propping up the Christian faith. To quote New Testament scholar and agnostic Bart Ehrman, no serious historian doubts the existence of Jesus. We have more evidence for Jesus than for almost anyone of his time period. And given the substantial evidence for the historicity of Jesus, former Duke and Oxford professor E.P. Sanders writes, there are no substantial doubts about the general course of Jesus' life, where and when he lived, approximately where and when he died, and the sorts of things he did during his public activity. Now, you're likely wondering at this point, why does seemingly every historian, New Testament professor, and classics professor believe Jesus existed? Well, the first and probably biggest reason is because of the New Testament fragmentary evidence. In terms of evidence, the New Testament is far and away the best attested document in classical antiquity. There are no question about that, and there's heaps of manuscript, and I want to show you a couple examples just to get a scope of what we're looking at with the reliability. First up, we have Tacitus' Annals of Imperial Rome. It's a very important tome for understanding ancient history and many of the emperors, as I'll talk about a little bit later. All we have with Tacitus is 2 partial manuscripts, but widely considered historically reliable. Next up, I want to look at Virgil's Aeneid. I don't know if I said that right. Sorry to classics people in here. We have 3 complete manuscripts, 7 partial manuscripts, and 20 fragmentary manuscripts. So really strong historical reliability. As for the New Testament, we have 4 complete manuscripts, 340 partial manuscripts, and 5,000 plus fragmentary manuscripts, and that's looking at the Greek alone, not to include the Syriac, Coptic, or Latin. So in terms of the New Testament evidence, it's rock-solid historical reliability. And yet many people are skeptical of the New Testament because of the seeming bias in it. But it's worth highlighting, even if the New Testament is biased, that shouldn't affect their historical treatment. One doesn't have to believe the theology of the New Testament to look at and assess the text's historical reliability. Now we can see bias elsewhere in Antiquities, in the writings of Tacitus, who wrote from a pro-Roman perspective, and in the writings of Josephus, who wrote from a pro-Jewish perspective. Especially when dealing with ancient sources like these, who most of them were constructed on organic papyri and manuscript, a certain amount of bias is to be expected when we're looking at them. Writing and copying was extremely expensive, so we can assume that if someone took the time to invest the time and resources to make a copy, they thought it was very important that they do so. The bottom line is that every historical source we have is written from a certain perspective. And that perspective, whatever it is, whether you disagree or not, it doesn't delegitimize its history. With that being said, I recognize that even still, there are some in here today who remain very skeptical of the New Testament. And I'm sympathetic to that. However, that doesn't mean if we take away the New Testament, there is no evidence for the history of Jesus. That's a myth I often hear, that Jesus is not recorded anywhere outside of the Bible or the Quran. So next, I want to turn to several ancient non-Christian sources to investigate what we can know about Jesus from them. Now, first among them would be the renowned first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He wrote the Antiquities of the Jewish people around the year 93. Now, in his history, he makes note of the several major players of the Jesus story. Obviously, Jesus. We have John the Baptist. We have Caiaphas the high priest. And we have Pontius Pilate. Now, for the purposes of today, I'm simply going to focus on what he says about Jesus. Now, I'll say at the outset, there is some controversy over Josephus because it seems like a scribe with an explicit Christian bias wrote multiple additions to the text that weren't originally there. And as you see, I'm not going to overstate my case. I've highlighted those on the screen and put brackets around them so you know what's a later addition and what's original. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of such surprising works, a teacher of such men that received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, has condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for they reported that he appeared alive to them, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. He also says, the high priest Annas convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Now, these later additions aside, it's worth highlighting again that Josephus was Jewish. He was not a Christian, so there's no reason to include these details unless he saw them as important to his Jewish history. So next, I want to highlight the aforementioned Tacitus. He wrote the Annals of Imperial Rome, and around 116 AD, he's widely regarded to be the greatest of Roman historians. Much of what we know today about the Roman emperors, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, comes directly from this book. And the section that relates to Jesus itself is a bit long, so I had to cut out a bit in order to save time. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition that, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Now, I've cited right there where you can find where in Tacitus he says that. And from this, I just want to highlight the fact that these are the exact details recorded in Luke's Gospel, chapter 3 and 23, respectively. Last, I want to take a look at Pliny the Younger, around 112 AD, and his letter to the Emperor Trajan. The Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny trust when they should be called upon to deliver. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble and then partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So gathered together, taking all the ancient non-Christian sources that talk about Jesus, here's what we can know. Jesus existed. Jesus was known to be a moral teacher. His followers believed him to be the Jewish Messiah. He had a reputation as a miracle worker. He was condemned to death by crucifixion under the authority of Pontius Pilate, per the suggestion of Jewish chief priests during the Passover. The movement he founded stopped temporarily after his death, then very quickly resumed. Christians were subjected to violent persecution in the first few decades following his death, and Christians would meet on a fixed day to worship Jesus together. Now again, I want to highlight what's striking about this list is that this list is all from and all derived from ancient non-Christian sources, and it confirms the basic outline of the Christian message. Now this list makes up what is called the minimal facts of Jesus. It's a list that comprises what the scholarly consensus is on what is the very minimum we can know about Jesus. Now this is not the full list. These are just the parts of the list that are derived exclusively from non-Christian sources. When we combine Christian sources, there's two facts I want to highlight that are very interesting for our talk today. The tomb in which Jesus was buried was found empty. Jesus' disciples were convinced that he had risen from the dead, and that he appeared to them post-mortem on a number of occasions. Now let me tell you at the outset, as for these last two, I was just as surprised as you likely are that historians, regardless of religious orientation, take these things to be facts about Jesus. In the words of the aforementioned E.P. Sanders, that Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. Now, what the reality was that gave rise to the experiences is, I do not know. Sanders helpfully highlights the important question that we must ask and answer in light of the minimum facts about Jesus. Namely, what narrative best accounts for the data that we have historically? Now, I'd like to make the case that the literal, physical resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth makes the most sense of all the information we have. Now, I recognize that for some, that claim might sound absolutely incredible. Dead people do not come back to life, and I would generally agree with that. But as for its impossibility, I think the only way it's impossible for someone to rise from the dead is if a priori we rule out the existence of God. If God exists, then I don't find it that implausible that he might have the power to raise someone from the dead. So I'd like to ask a favor for the next 10 minutes-ish. I'd like all of you in here to just temporarily suspend your belief in the existence or non-existence of God. See, the thing is, if you're here today and you're convinced there is no God, there's absolutely nothing I can say next that is going to even make you consider that there is a plausible case for the resurrection of Jesus. Likewise, if you're here today and you're convinced that there is a God, but you haven't really looked at the evidence, then I'd like to invite you to suspend your belief as well, so you can weigh the evidence for yourself. Now, I'm not going to try to force anyone to change what they believe. I'm just asking everyone to suspend their beliefs temporarily so that the case can be legitimately heard. Now, one of the most common objections I've heard is that the disciples made the whole resurrection story up. However, there are some major problems with this narrative. Firstly, the gospel narratives record women as being eyewitnesses of the empty tomb. Now let us step back and assume for a second that the Gospels are biased and that the disciples actually just made the whole thing up in order to convince the world of a lie. The first thing that they would need to do is very credibly establish that the tomb of Jesus was empty. And if you're trying to seem credible while fabricating a story, it would be really preposterous to list women as the primary eyewitnesses of the empty tomb. Now that sounds really sexist, and you know what? It is. But that is the reality of ancient Rome. A woman's witness at the time was not even considered valid in the court of law. To quote Josephus, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of their levity and boldness of their sex." Now, that is absolutely absurd, but such was the historical context that the Gospels emerged in. That being said, the fact that the Gospel writers consistently attested to the fact that women were the primary eyewitnesses of the empty tomb is historically regarded as a mark of authenticity simply because it would be too incredible to make up. The only reason it could have been written is just because that's actually how it was. To quote former Oxford professor of Jewish studies Geza Vermesh, "From these various records, two reasonably convincing points emerge, one positive and one negative. First, the women belonging to the entourage of Jesus discovered an empty tomb and were definite that it was the tomb. Second, the rumor that the apostles stole the body is most improbable." Now, thankfully, Vermesh gives a nice segue to another common argument that fits with the suggestion that the disciples stole the body and they made the resurrection up, and that is, these disciples stole the body. So the argument's going something like, okay, maybe I'll grant that there is an empty tomb, but that's because the disciples stole the body. Now, in terms of counter-narratives available to work with, I think this one is the least tenable, as I'm going to argue. Now, history shows that 11 out of 12 of Jesus' closest followers were tortured and killed for testifying that Jesus rose from the dead. Makes it highly, highly implausible that they would make this up. Now, surely someone might rightly object, okay, well, a lot of religions have martyrs, so how could Christians try to make a case for the resurrection based off martyrs? Is that actually a good reason? Let's consider this for a moment. What the argument boils down to is that a conniving group of Jesus' followers thought up this idea of tricking the rest of the world. They stole the body to help fabricate their narrative that Jesus actually rose from the dead and he actually was God. And then they knowingly constructed this lie to deceive people, and they were tortured and killed for their lie. I just want to give you a thought experiment for a second. If you made up a lie, would you be willing to be tortured and die for it? Further, what if you and 10 others agreed to try and make something up and never admit that you made it up? How likely is it that all of you get tortured and die, and not one of you admits that it was actually a lie? That's the internal logic of claiming the disciples stole the body. Is it possible? Sure. Is it at all plausible? No. Dare I say, if that happened, it would be an even greater miracle than the resurrection of Jesus. Now, of course, there's other options, such as, what if Jesus didn't die? What if he faked it? Yeah, gotta love the internet. Now, probably the biggest objection to this claim is simply the fact that Romans are historically regarded as the masters of death. They invented the crucifixion out of trying to think of what is the absolute worst way we could kill someone that would maximize pain and maximize their suffering, and then the crucifixion. So it's a pretty safe bet when they attempted to kill someone, they did kill them. So when it comes to Jesus, I think it's a safe assumption if the Romans are trying to kill him, they made sure he was actually dead, like the rest of their prisoners. And say for the sake of conspiracy, Jesus miraculously survived. I'd like to ask the question then, how did he get out of the tomb that was blocked by a multiple-ton stone? If we say the disciples did it, then we're back to the objection I just talked about earlier. And if we say he did it, it would be quite a remarkable show of strength for someone who was within centimeters of their life hours before. Now, others have suggested that those who saw Jesus post-mortem must have experienced mass hallucinations and were convinced from them that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, unfortunately, mass hallucinations are a psychological impossibility. So if that were the case, then once again, we're calling on the miraculous to do away with the miraculous. Finally, it's just worth asking, how else can we account for the explosive growth of Christianity immediately following the death of Jesus? A growth that included thousands of Jews proclaiming that Jesus was God. We're talking about members of a staunchly monotheistic faith seemingly overnight being convinced into believing that Jesus of Nazareth was God in the flesh. How do we explain that otherwise? Taken together, how can we explain these various phenomena? Jewish historian Pinchas Lapide sums up his take on the resurrection as follows. Concerning the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday, I was for decades a denier. I am no longer a denier, since the following deliberation has caused me to think this through anew. When these peasants, shepherds, and fishermen, who betrayed and denied their master and then failed him considerably, suddenly could be changed overnight into a confident mission society, convinced of salvation and able to work with much more success after Easter than before Easter, then no vision or hallucination is sufficient to explain such a revolutionary transformation. If the defeated and oppressed group of disciples overnight could change into a victorious movement of faith, based only on autosuggestion or self-deception, without a fundamental faith experience, then this would be a much greater miracle than the resurrection itself. In a purely logical analysis, the resurrection of Jesus is the lesser of two evils for all those who seek a rational explanation for the worldwide consequence of the Easter faith. Now, one of the unique things that sets Christianity apart is that Christianity rises and falls on a single historical claim. To quote Paul in 1 Corinthians, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. What makes Christianity is not how God created the world. It's not whether Adam and Eve were literal people. It's not how big the flood was. It's not whether Jesus was born from a virgin. It's not even whether everything in the Bible is true. The bottom line is that even if the Bible is full of fables and myths, if Jesus of Nazareth died and rose from the dead, Christianity is true. Christians believe that that baby born in Bethlehem around 4 BCE grew up to be an itinerant preacher in the town of Galilee, who alongside breathtaking morals and demonstration of miraculous powers, he believed himself to be God. That this preacher shook up the religious establishment, was crucified at the hands of the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate because he saw himself to be God, and that this man was executed and walked out of the grave 3 days later. It is a breathtaking story, but as I've tried to argue today, it's not just a story, it's history. I don't know personally where everyone in here stands on this question, but the history is there to investigate for yourself. Hopefully, you can agree that the question isn't whether Jesus existed, but whether Jesus rose from the dead. Now, I'd urge you, as Christmas is approaching, don't let this holiday season pass without considering the story of Jesus, and specifically the question of his resurrection. If it's true, then that changes everything. Thank you.